They say people who criticize others are simply honest, that they're just telling the truth. But honesty rarely leaves a trail of quiet wounds behind it. Somewhere in offices, classrooms, families, and friend circles, there exists a subtle pattern, a sentence that sounds like advice but feels like humiliation, a joke that draws laughter but leaves someone smaller than before. And strangely, the people who do this often appear confident, certain, almost powerful. But psychology tells a different story. Because the habit of putting others down is rarely about the person being criticized. It is often a silent signal of something unresolved beneath the surface, insecurity, hidden comparison, or a fragile sense of self trying to stay above water. Why do some people feel compelled to diminish others just to feel stable? What invisible fears hide behind those cutting remarks? And what does this pattern reveal about the human mind? Today, this quiet psychological mechanism will be explored. Let's begin.
Sometimes, the deepest wounds are not created by loud cruelty. They are created by quiet sentences. A comment spoken casually at a dinner table, a sarcastic remark in a meeting, a heinous joke shared in front of friends, and everyone laughs, except the one person who feels something shift inside. Because words carry weight, not always loudly, but persistently, like drops of water slowly carving grooves into stone. You may have experienced this before, a moment when someone said something about your intelligence, your appearance, your ideas, or your dreams. It was framed as humor, or honesty, or just an observation. Yet something about it stayed with you. Why? Psychology suggests that human beings are deeply sensitive to social evaluation. The brain is wired to detect signals of acceptance or rejection. Even subtle forms of criticism can activate the same neural pathways associated with physical pain. Which means something important. Those moments that seem small often are not. Over time, repeated remarks can become an invisible erosion of confidence. One sentence alone may not break the surface, but 10, 50, 100? Slowly, the mind begins asking quiet questions. Was that comment true? Do others see me that way too? Maybe I really am less capable, less interesting, less worthy. And this is how the damage works, not through dramatic confrontation, but through accumulation. Like sediment building at the bottom of a river, these experiences begin shaping the way a person sees themselves. Strangely, many people who experience this behavior hesitate to acknowledge it. They minimize the moment. It was probably just a joke. Maybe I'm being too sensitive. They didn't mean it that way. But emotional discomfort is rarely meaningless. It is often a signal, a quiet indication that something beneath the surface deserves attention. Because when someone repeatedly puts others down, even subtly, it reveals something about their psychological landscape. Not necessarily cruelty, but something unresolved, something searching for stability. Understanding this pattern requires looking deeper, beyond the surface of words, beyond the moment itself. Because the habit of diminishing others rarely begins in adulthood. It usually begins much earlier, long before the first sarcastic remark, long before the first cutting joke. To understand this behavior fully, the story must travel back to where these patterns are often formed.
Human behavior rarely appears out of nowhere. Like a river carving its path through stone, patterns form slowly, shaped by the landscapes people grow up in. A person who constantly puts others down did not wake up one morning and decide to become that way. More often, the habit was learned long before adulthood, sometimes in environments where criticism was simply part of daily life. Imagine a child growing up in a home where praise is rare, but correction is constant. Every mistake highlighted, every effort compared, every success measured against someone else. You could have done better.
Why can't you be more like them? That's not impressive. At first, the child simply listens, but slowly something deeper happens. The mind begins to internalize a quiet message. Value must be earned through comparison. And comparison always requires a scale, someone above, someone below. In such environments, emotional language becomes shaped by competition rather than connection. Approval is scarce, and criticism becomes the dominant currency of communication. Over time, this dynamic begins to shape the child's understanding of relationships, not as spaces of mutual support, but as arenas of evaluation. Psychologists often describe this process as social modeling. Children learn not only from what they are told, but from what they observe. If authority figures frequently criticize, belittle, or mock others, those behaviors begin to feel normal, familiar, even necessary. The child learns something subtle but powerful. To survive emotionally, it may feel safer to judge others before being judged, safer to point out flaws before someone notices their own. What begins as protection can slowly evolve into habit. Years pass, the child grows into an adult, the environment changes, new friendships form, careers begin, relationships develop. But the old communication pattern remains quietly embedded beneath the surface. A sarcastic comment here, a dismissive remark there, a quick critique when someone shares an idea. Often, the person speaking these words may not even notice the pattern themselves. To them, it feels normal. It feels like honesty. It feels like confidence. But beneath that surface behavior, something else often remains. The echo of earlier experiences. The subtle belief that worth must always be measured, compared, defended. And this belief creates fertile ground for another powerful psychological force, one that shapes much of human social behavior: insecurity. Because when self-worth feels fragile, the mind begins searching for ways to stabilize it, sometimes by standing slightly above someone else.
Confidence is quiet. It does not need to announce itself in every conversation. It does not need to prove its intelligence in every debate, and it rarely feels threatened by someone else's success. But insecurity behaves very differently. Insecurity is restless. It scans the room. It listens carefully to every achievement, every compliment, every moment where someone else shines. And when that happens, something inside begins to stir, a subtle tension, a quiet comparison. Because when self-worth feels unstable, another person's success can feel strangely personal, almost like a threat to one's own identity. Psychologists describe this process through a concept known as downward social comparison. The human mind constantly evaluates itself in relation to others, sometimes upward, comparing with those who seem more successful, sometimes downward, comparing with those who appear less capable. Both forms of comparison influence self-perception. But downward comparison has a very particular emotional effect. It creates temporary relief. If someone else can be framed as less intelligent, less attractive, less competent, then for a moment the fragile sense of self feels safer, higher, more stable. This is why belittling behavior often appears in subtle forms: a compliment followed by a criticism, a joke that quietly targets someone's weakness, a casual remark pointing out another person's mistake. Not dramatic attacks, just enough to tilt the psychological scale, just enough to restore a sense of position. To the outside observer, it may look like arrogance or confidence or blunt honesty, but internally the dynamic is often very different. Because genuine confidence does not depend on the reduction of others. Only fragile confidence does. This creates a quiet paradox.
The people who most frequently attempt to appear superior may actually be the ones who feel the least secure about their place in the world. Like a structure built on unstable ground, their self-image requires constant reinforcement. And one of the easiest reinforcements available is comparison. But there is something important to understand. These behaviors are rarely conscious strategies. They are automatic responses developed over years, sometimes decades, of protecting a vulnerable sense of identity. And over time, these patterns begin shaping more than just occasional comments. They begin shaping an entire persona, a mask carefully maintained.
Superiority can be convincing. It can appear in confident speech, sharp observations, and the ability to point out flaws with precision. Some people seem to move through conversations with an air of certainty, always ready with a critique, always quick to correct. To others, it may look like intelligence, authority, even strength. But psychology often reveals a more complex reality, because sometimes what looks like superiority is actually a performance, a mask carefully worn to keep deeper insecurities hidden. Human beings construct identities to feel safe in the social world. These identities are often built around roles: the smart one, the successful one, the rational one, the one who always knows better. Once a person begins to define themselves through such roles, protecting that image becomes emotionally important, almost necessary. But maintaining an image of superiority comes with a quiet challenge. If others appear equally capable or more capable, the identity begins to feel unstable, and instability creates discomfort. So the mind searches for ways to restore balance. One of the simplest methods is subtle devaluation, pointing out another person's mistake, dismissing someone's idea before it grows, turning achievements into something trivial. Each remark may seem small, but together they create a hierarchy, one where the speaker quietly places themselves above, not through open conflict, but through narrative. Over time, this behavior can become a kind of social armor, a shield that protects the fragile identity beneath it. Yet masks have a cost, because when superiority becomes a defensive identity, genuine connection becomes difficult. People may laugh at the remarks, they may nod along with the criticisms, but something deeper begins to change in the emotional atmosphere. Trust fades, warmth disappears, and the person behind the mask may slowly find themselves surrounded by distance rather than closeness. Ironically, the very strategy used to feel secure can lead to greater isolation, because relationships thrive on mutual respect, not silent hierarchies. But even within the person who wears this mask, something else is often happening: a quiet internal struggle, a tension between the identity they project and the uncertainty they rarely allow themselves to acknowledge. And this tension creates the next layer of the story, an inner conflict that many people carrying this pattern experience without fully understanding.
From the outside, the person who constantly criticizes others may seem certain of their opinions, certain of their judgments, certain of their place above the people around them. But human psychology is rarely that simple. Beneath confident behavior, the inner landscape can be surprisingly fragile, because maintaining a sense of superiority requires constant effort. The mind must remain alert, always scanning conversations for moments where someone else might appear more knowledgeable, more talented, or more admired. Every compliment directed at another person becomes noticeable. Every achievement in the room quietly registers. And with each moment, the internal dialogue begins. What if they are better than me? What if others notice? What if I lose my place?
These thoughts may never be spoken aloud. Often they are not even fully conscious, but they shape reactions in subtle ways. A quick criticism, a dismissive joke, a correction delivered with sharp confidence. Each response becomes a small attempt to stabilize an uncertain internal ground. Yet the strange paradox is this: the more these behaviors are used, the more the underlying insecurity remains unresolved, because external comparisons cannot truly repair internal doubt. They only postpone it. And over time, this creates a psychological loop. The person criticizes others to feel secure. The temporary relief fades, the insecurity returns, and the cycle begins again. Inside this cycle, the individual may experience something that is rarely discussed: emotional fatigue, even if they never openly admit it. Maintaining superiority is exhausting. It requires vigilance, constant evaluation, continuous defense of identity. And sometimes, in quieter moments, moments without an audience, without conversation, without comparison, a different awareness may appear. A faint recognition that something about this pattern feels hollow, that the victories feel temporary, that the distance growing between themselves and others feels lonely. This awareness does not always arrive dramatically. Often it appears gradually, through small cracks in the carefully maintained identity. And those cracks can eventually lead to something unexpected, a moment of realization, one that has the potential to interrupt the entire pattern.
Patterns can persist for years, sometimes even decades. A person may move through workplaces, friendships, and relationships carrying the same habit of subtle criticism, never fully noticing the emotional traces left behind. At first, the consequences are small. A friend grows quieter during conversations. A colleague stops sharing ideas. Someone laughs politely, but begins creating distance. These moments are easy to overlook. After all, people are busy. Relationships change. Conversations shift. But slowly, the emotional atmosphere begins to feel different. Something becomes colder, less open. The easy warmth that once existed in conversations begins to fade, replaced by a quiet caution. Others start choosing their words carefully, or choosing silence instead. And over time, the person who once felt socially powerful through criticism may notice something unexpected. The room grows quieter when they speak, not with admiration, but with restraint. Psychologists often describe this as social feedback, the subtle signals people send through behavior rather than words. Fewer invitations, shorter conversations, emotional distance that cannot easily be explained. At first, the mind may resist these signals. People are too sensitive. They can't handle honesty. They misunderstand me. These explanations protect the identity that has been built over time. But occasionally, a different moment arrives. Perhaps someone offers direct feedback. A friend says something honestly. A partner expresses hurt. A colleague finally speaks openly about how certain remarks feel. Or sometimes, the realization comes in silence, through the growing loneliness that appears when connection begins to disappear. In that quiet space, a difficult question may surface. Why does this keep happening? This question is uncomfortable because answering it requires turning the lens inward rather than outward. It requires acknowledging that the strategy once used for protection may now be creating isolation. Not everyone reaches this realization, but for those who do, something important becomes possible: awareness. And awareness is powerful, because once a person begins to see a pattern clearly, it becomes harder to continue it unconsciously. The automatic comments start to feel noticeable. The subtle criticisms become visible. The mask of superiority begins to feel heavier, less convincing. And in that moment, the story can begin to change. Not through sudden transformation, but through understanding.
Being on the receiving end of repeated criticism or subtle put-downs can feel heavy. It can chip away at confidence, cloud judgment, and even make a person doubt their own perceptions. But understanding is a quiet power. When you recognize that someone's belittling behavior often comes from insecurity, early experiences, or fragile self-esteem, it becomes possible to see the behavior without absorbing its weight. Noticing does not mean excusing. Understanding does not require approval. The mind can observe. The heart can witness. You may begin to realize that the words you hear are reflections, not necessarily of your worth, but of another person's inner turbulence. This perspective creates space. Space to respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively. Space to maintain confidence rather than self-doubt. Space to protect your own emotional equilibrium. In psychology, this is sometimes called psychological distancing, a method to separate one's own identity from the influence of someone else's emotional patterns. It is not a wall to shut others out. It is a lens to see clearly. Through this clarity, interactions no longer have to be emotionally draining. You may notice the subtle patterns, the jokes, the critiques, the comparisons, and yet you can keep your sense of self intact. This does not erase the sting of a harsh word or the discomfort of a cutting remark, but it allows for gentleness toward yourself. It reminds you that the world contains fragile human hearts, some of which express their fear by trying to lift themselves through the lowering of others. And recognizing this truth can be quietly liberating, because the people who diminish others do not define your value. Their insecurities, their masks, their struggles, they are theirs alone.
Human beings are fragile, not in the sense of weakness, but in the sense of hidden complexity. Layers of experience, trauma, hope, and fear intertwined in ways the outside world rarely sees. Sometimes, those who diminish others are navigating a storm we cannot witness. Insecurity, loneliness, unacknowledged pain. They may believe that keeping themselves above others is the only way to feel safe. And yet, the cost is quiet, cumulative, for them and for those around them. Recognizing this truth does not mean excusing the behavior. It does not mean tolerating harm, but it does allow for perspective, an understanding that human hearts are often carrying more than we realize. By holding both truths, a delicate balance emerges: compassion without absorption, awareness without self-diminishment. The experience of being put down, subtle or overt, leaves marks. But those marks can also be a teacher, illuminating the fragile ways we navigate worth, belonging, and self-expression. And for those who observe these patterns in others, a gentle reflection arises. Everyone carries hidden landscapes of fear and longing. Some express it through distance, criticism, or comparison. Others through silence, retreat, or overachievement. Understanding does not erase pain, but it transforms it into insight, into empathy, into clarity. If this video made you feel seen, if parts of this reflection felt familiar, if something quiet inside you was touched, know that you are not alone. The experience of being diminished or witnessing the subtle ways humans guard fragile self-esteem is more common than it feels. Your worth is not defined by another's attempts to feel stronger. If you'd like to stay connected, this channel is a space where we explore the hidden corners of the human heart. You may choose to share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes your words help someone else feel less alone. Take care of yourself. You deserve gentleness. You deserve to heal.